Hey there, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. As ever, it is fab to hear. It's fab to have you here. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Verity, and I talk about all things podcasting. Very unoriginal to talk about podcasting on a podcast. And if you're not new here, then welcome back. It is great to have you here as ever. We are now on to episode 2 of our marketing and sales for podcasting series. And this, as I mentioned to you in the first episode, where I reviewed my learnings from Dan Knowlton's talk at Greenhouse, Jersey. This was a conference that I attended in October of 2023. It's all about marketing and sales for entrepreneurs, but I went with the mindset of, well, what can I learn from a marketing and sales point of view that can be applied to podcasting? Essentially, how can I market my podcast more strategically or just better? I'm not sure that was the best English, but how can I market my podcast better to get more listeners, more subscribers, more watchers for the YouTube channel and all that good stuff? So in the first episode of this series, I talked over the learnings that I took from Dan Knowlton's talk. Dan was talking very much about forgetting everything you know about podcasting. Forgetting everything you know about marketing, and some really fresh perspectives in there. So if you haven't listened to that episode, make sure that you go back and listen to that episode first. But today I am going to be giving you my key takeaways from the lovely Joe Glover. He is the co-founder of the Marketing Meetup, and I just love the philosophy. First of all, the website's all pink and beautiful, but everything that they do is just all about being positively lovely and just being lovely and sharing the kindness, which I loved. I think we don't get enough of that in 2023. But his talk was all about how to keep customers and turn them into your biggest fans. And I thought, well, great. We don't have customers necessarily as podcasters, but if we replace the word customers with listeners and turn them into your biggest fan, all of a sudden, everything that he said was just 100% relevant to podcasting. So I have got some incredibly brief notes. His talk was right near the end of the day. So I'd kind of got to that point where my handwriting was getting quite scruffy, but it was such a good talk. And if you ever get to have the opportunity to listen to Joe Glover talk, I really, really would recommend it. To kick off, there are a few different things that he started off with. The first one was talking about what is it that makes you distinctive and what is it that makes you relatively different. And I love this because I think in podcasting, we often don't think enough about what makes our particular podcast distinctive and relatively different to other people's podcasts and other podcasts that are out there. So the things that he was talking about were around branding. And again, don't think there's enough conversation around branding in podcasting. We talk about our cover art so often, but what is the actual branding that is pulled through, that it's obvious that when you see something, you're like, oh yeah, that's Verity's podcast. That's the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. That's this, that's that. So really talking about the branding. He was also talking about the tone of voice. So what's the language that we're using as well when promoting our podcasts? And what are you for? Essentially, what are your values? What is it that your podcast is valued by? What are those, those core things that drive you as a podcaster and drives your narrative as a podcaster as well? Now, obviously, he was talking about this much more in terms of marketing a business and sales and services, but I'm just applying this across to podcasting because I think it just works so well. So those are my first things too that I was thinking about, is branding, our tone of voice when it comes to promoting our podcast, and are also considering what are you for? What are the values of your podcast? And I think actually that those are questions that we just don't ask enough. And I would almost challenge you before you go any further, actually maybe after this episode, listen to the rest of the episode first, but I would actually challenge you after this episode to really sit down and consider, what is your podcast for? What is your branding? What is the tone of voice of your podcast? And just seeing what comes to mind, really. The next point that I got from Joe Glover was all about sharing your podcast through word of mouth. Now, as I was saying, obviously he was talking more about business and sales and what have you, but he was saying that individuals are 4 times more likely to purchase a product that they have been told about through word of mouth versus something that they've seen ads for or they've seen the company promote themselves. So this then got me thinking about how can we apply that to podcasting and essentially get people to tell other people, get your listeners to tell other people about your podcast. And it goes back to the power of that final call to action in your outro, which is encouraging people to go and tell somebody else about your podcast. You know, if they loved your episode, who else can they share it with? If they loved your podcast episode, who can they tell about it? Can they screenshot them listening to the podcast and put it on Instagram stories, for example, and tag you in? Can they take a picture of them listening to your podcast episode and stick that up wherever on social media and get people to recommend your podcast essentially? So I think that that is so super powerful. And it's just worth remembering that, as I said, people trust people and people are more likely to buy a product from somebody that is recommended by somebody else as opposed to the brand, which is why UGC content is so, so powerful. But like I said, applying that to your podcast, getting people to recommend your podcast, getting people to tell other people how much they're enjoying your podcast is probably going to be so much more beneficial than you constantly on social media saying, listen to my podcast, listen to my podcast, listen to my podcast. And by the way, if that is you, go back and listen to the previous episode because we talked about how we could deliver and promote our podcast without constantly saying, come listen to my podcast. So that I thought was a huge, huge takeaway and a really powerful takeaway as well. Linked into that is being specific from your asks. So again, this links into your call to action, particularly in your outros. If you're still thinking of designing your outro or thinking of redesigning your outro, then check out either the show notes or the description box, depending if you're on listening to podcast or on YouTube. And I will link in how to create your own killer intro. But being specific about your call to action, exactly what is it that you want an individual to do? So in that respect, asking people to share your podcast episode, to tell somebody about your podcast, to name drop your podcast, whatever it is, asking your listeners to do that is going to be a surefire way. Might not be the quickest way, but it's going to be a really good guaranteed way of bringing in new listeners to your podcast. So I love that. I absolutely love that. And I'm going to make a bit of a resolution for myself, as cringy as it might feel, but to just talk to actual people about the podcast even more. Because even though that's still me as the brand promoting my own podcast, it's still going to hopefully get people talking about the podcast. And, oh yeah, I know this person who does a podcast. Or have you heard Verity's podcast? And people go away and listen to it, because it goes back as well to what we've talked about in previous episodes, how we spend so long on social media promoting our podcast, but we don't tell the people in our immediate friendship and family circles who are probably going to actually support us the most if we just gave them half a chance. And my final takeaway from the lovely Joe Glover's talk was about being respectful of your energy. And what I've written down here is be respectful of your energy and what you can cope with regarding workload. And I just think that that is so important in 2023, where we are all running around like blue ass flies, it feels half the time, you know, trying to be on this social platform, trying to be on that social platform, trying to keep up with that trend, trying to keep up with, you know, what the next person is doing. And it's being respectful of your energy, because at the end of the day, you're not going to enjoy what you do unless you're being respectful of that energy. If you're, you know, trying to create content or podcast episodes from a really burnt out place and a place of just trying to create the next episode, that's really going to come across in your content. Versus if you've got a manageable workload that you enjoy showing up for, other people are going to enjoy showing up for that content as well. So that to me was just such an amazing takeaway of be respectful of your energy and be respectful of your energy and what you can cope with regarding your own workload. So those have been my key takeaways from Joe Glover's talk at Greenhouse Jersey. By the way, none of this content is sponsored by Greenhouse. I just thought it would be so interesting to share my learnings with you all so that hopefully you can all have a little nugget that you can take away and implement for your own podcast. I'm going to take my own advice here and ask you, if you found this episode useful, please, I would love it if you could tell somebody else who has also got a podcast and who is looking for different ways of marketing their podcast. Let them know. Just bring it up in conversation or share it to social media and tell your audience about it. But I would love it if you could share this episode and just, like I said, anyone who you know is in podcasting, your mate who's got a podcast, even if there's only 2 people listening to it, or even if you've got Stephen Bartlett as your mate, whoever it is that you know who has got a podcast, I would love it if you could share this episode with them. You never know what nuggets they might also take away from it. Otherwise, I will see you next episode for part 3 of the series of Marketing Your Podcast. I'll see you then.